I'll introduce myself. And I know some of you, but not all of you. My name is Shelley Mayer, and I'm the founder and president of Ramp Communications. I've been working in the purpose and social responsibility space back since my corporate days when I worked at Toyota Canada. I was a brand manager there, and we were doing work around purpose-led brand strategies at that time. The focus of Ramp has been in the social impact space, and most recently, our real priority is helping organizations scale their impact through strategy, partnerships, brand, and communications primarily. So that's a little bit about me. I will ask, well, I guess I was going to say, I know Rebecca and Karen going way back, so I've been pleased to reconnect with them over this project, but Rebecca and I worked together when she was a board member at SolarShare, which was one of Ramp's earliest clients. And Karen and I worked together way back when I was at Toyota, building one of those purpose spots that I mentioned when she was doing some work with Special Olympics Canada. So I will let the two of them introduce themselves. Do you want to kick us off, Karen?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Malone. I founded Lit Park, an ESG consultancy, just coming up 5 years. I'm celebrating my 5th anniversary, which I'm thrilled about. What Lit Park offers is helping corporations and nonprofits design and define their ESG roadmap or their strategies on ESG, and that can be an ESG program or a simple initiative. I also offer upskilling and education for your ESG needs, for your director level, management level, et cetera, et cetera. I am the co-creator with Rebecca on designing ESG, and thrilled to be talking to you a little bit more about that a little later. But in my time in this space, I've had the luxury of being able to train over 500 individuals here in Canada, literally coast to coast to coast, on ESG in over 25 different sectors. So I am thrilled to have achieved that accomplishment in the 5 years, but looking forward to many, many more. Rebecca.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Black, and I run a boutique consultancy called Blackcurrant. So for the past 15 years, Blackcurrant has been doing strategic communications and design with a range of clients that all have one thing in common. They're all focused on solving for climate change. And as my understanding of that space has evolved, so too has our understanding of the social justice piece for climate, in addition to carbon. I'm also the co-founder of a national nonprofit called WIRE, Women in Renewable Energy, and that was created to elevate the role and recognition of women working in the energy sector. And most recently, I've just graduated from a really amazing program at OCADU. It's a Masters of Design program called Strategic Foresight and Innovation. And by taking that program, I gained a whole new skill set in terms of problem solving that I've been bringing to our clients and to the collaborations that I do, including this great Designing ESG program that I've been working on with Karen. So that's a little bit about me. I'm thrilled to see some familiar faces today, as well as new faces. So welcome everyone to the call. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Great, thank you for that. So we're going to kick things off with a bit of a level set question. I think people may be coming into this event with different backgrounds and levels of knowledge and context. So I think we'll start with just maybe a little bit of an explanation on really what is ESG. And so I'm going to hand that question off to Karen to get us kicked off.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Shelley. So ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance. So it's a construct, a framework that has sort of come out of the ashes of CSR, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability. And what it is it helps inform your organization's environmental, social governance topics of relevance that you can either develop an enterprise risk management profile from, or a long-term business strategy that using environmental social governance topics can really bring to life what are the most pressing, or what are seen to be the most pressing needs or pressures that organizations are facing. So it's coming to life because stakeholders are asking for it. So what's a stakeholder? We'll get more into that. But your stakeholders are your customers, your employees, investors, regulators, supply chain, you name it. If they are attracted or a part of your business, they are a stakeholder. And they really are coming to the forefront saying, hey, we need to better understand what are the environmental, social, governance topics that you as an organization are identifying as being significant to your business and of significant importance to your enterprise value. So its origins come in two different places. And given who's on the call today, my guess is it's showing up in your organization or your corporation, your business, your nonprofit, in ways that you're looking to either define your purpose or to understand how your business can be resilient through ESG topics. And you're looking to understand where these topics show up so that you can actually, one, understand the risk of these topics, and then two, develop a strategy to mitigate against these topics. Mitigation is one aspect. You could use these topics for innovation or opportunities for growth. It also shows up, though, and where I guess people really sort of homed in on the coining of ESG is in the financial space, and the financial space being funders and investors. And why it's of importance in this space is that those that are looking to either provide you with investments or invest in your company are looking to understand better how you are set up for these environmental social governance topics that are proving to be very tricky and very important for business success. So investors and lenders look to your ESG constructs, your strategies, your key performance indicators to help them be more informed on how your organization is set up to be resilient against these topics. So another area where and why the importance of ESG is coming to life. So that's a fair amount of jargon. So I'm just going to spend the last minute by giving you a real life situation. Well, real life, but made up. So let's say I am a film production house based in British Columbia. And I've had a business for 10 years making movies all over the province of BC. But in the past 2 years, I have had COVID, I have had floods, and I have had forest fires, climate-related weather incidents, like a pandemic, not like a pandemic that has caused significant stress on my business. I wasn't able to make films because I wasn't able to access production sites. I wasn't able to secure a healthy employee base or production crew because of either COVID or they weren't accessible to the production site. And I've let down the cities that I would be filming in or the communities that I'd be filming in. So the social economic value of my production has now just diminished the community that I had signed up to put a movie shoot on. Add that to the fact that my sector as a whole, the film business, creates a significant amount of GHG emissions. And I'm now being regulated not only by my government, but also by security standards here in Canada, that I have to now disclose my GHG emissions to make sure that I am within the range so that we do not overachieve against the 1.5 degrees. So even with that 2-minute example, that should identify about, 10 different ESG topics that my business should be worried about.
Yeah, thanks. The example really brings it home, Karen. That's great. So Rebecca, I'd love for you to share a bit with the group how it came to be that you two began working on this together and really, some of how designing ESG as a program fits into all of this.
Sure. So Karen and I actually have a rather long history with a big gap in the middle. We both actually started as young professionals working in the music industry, not as musicians, on the business side. And we actually shared the first big sort of business milestone of our careers together from different perspectives. So we worked for a record label, BMG Canada, and our first big hit, Karen on the sales side, myself on the marketing side, was breaking the Backstreet Boys in Canada. So that gives you an idea of how long we've known each other. And for those of you who are Backstreet Boys fans, you're welcome. And for those of you that aren't, our apologies. But that was how we first came to work together, and that was a great success. We both went on to do very different things as we left the music industry. But we reconnected a few years ago because our paths had both led us to sustainability and sustainable business. Mine in particular was around energy, technology, and carbon, and working with clients. Karen had come up through a foundational background and looked a lot more at the social impacts, and had eventually recognized that ESG was a topic that was going to persevere and thrive, and a great opportunity area. And as you heard when she mentioned, she's trained hundreds of professionals on ESG strategy fundamentals and how to understand ESG within the context of their organization. What Karen came to me with was a little bit of an observation, though, which was, you know, all of these people are going out and they've been trained in ESG, but there's a good subsection of them that are coming back and they're saying, okay, thanks, I know what you taught me. I know what ESG looks like. I don't even know where to start, or I'm having a hard time starting in my organization, or I'm running into cultural roadblocks in my organizations. And is there anything that you can do to help sort of that aspect? So I know the what, I'm struggling with the how. And so Karen and I started collaborating together. The program that I mentioned earlier, the Strategic Foresight in Innovation, is very much a problem-solving program. And it looks at different toolkits, design thinking, well, they're different but complementary, design thinking, systems thinking, and futures thinking, and exposes you to what, for me as a seasoned professional, were really paradigm shifting ways of approaching problem areas in an organizational context, and looking at different tools to be able to move forward and break through some of the ambiguity and the challenges. So Karen and I have collaborated. We've brought her deep, authentic, hands-on ESG experience with these tools that I have now brought out to my client base and applied in the sustainability space to say, how can we help people solve problems within their organizations related to ESG? And so the result is this, it's a 6-week program. I don't want to get marketing-y about it, because I'm excited to talk about sort of what the basics are of how anybody can bring this into their organization. But that's how our collaboration started, and that's where we are now. We're working on this empowerment and capacity building program for professionals who are interested in making change, positive change within their organizations.
Great, thank you. There was a question that came up in the chat. Maybe it's a little relevant, Karen, to your intro. How does this apply to governmental agencies? So I don't know if you want to just address that briefly in terms of the context of ESG before we jump into the next question.
Yeah, sure. So when you look at the environmental, social governance topics, they certainly do focus on being, having the sustainable development angle to this. And so any non-governmental or governmental agency will have implications from that expansion, for infrastructure, for transportation, for healthcare, for education, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all seen to be at the core of understanding where solutions need to be generated to move forward. And if we look at the evolution of ESG, you can see that it was policy first, but then government structures were put in place to follow policy in order to substantiate the conversation and the need. Government organizations were actually putting sort of this infrastructure in place, this framework in place, so that organizations could come on board to support those sustainable initiatives that make our country, our provinces, our cities more resilient going forward.
Great, thanks for adding that extra context. The next question gets into what motivates organizations, and you touched on some of the stakeholders early on, Karen. I know personally, as I mentioned at the outset, my firm, RAMP, is focused on helping organizations scale their social impact. And I've been speaking recently about the importance of this from a consumer perspective. And so I know, some of the research I've been sharing, it's really clear that consumers expect organizations, to be more, quote, purpose-driven. And I'll, come back to why I put that in air quotes, but, in one of the studies that I've been quoting frequently, the Zeno Strength of Purpose study, which I think Tina is going to share for us in the chat, 94% of consumers say that purpose is important, yet interestingly, only 37% of consumers believe companies today have a strong and clear purpose. And I put purpose in air quotes because in this particular study, when we ask consumers, what does purpose mean to you? They quote things like ethical and sustainable business practices, which obviously includes impact on the environment, creating new jobs, supporting social causes, having diverse and inclusive culture. So this is very deep cutting from consumer standpoint, the variety of things that they see and expect. So personally, I think that ESG topics are a good way to organize thinking as an organization around that to respond to those consumer needs. But I'm just going to invite Karen first, maybe to speak about what you see some of the key motivations are, or what stakeholders are looking for, and then I think Rebecca's going to follow up as well.
Yeah, so for sure, the voice of the customer is of huge significance more recently. But I think if we were to go back to my first when I was talking about the definition of ESG, I articulated the importance of the role of investors. And I would say that their contribution in the stakeholder realm of ESG is absolutely significant and equitable to your position from a customer or consumer perspective. And why is that? And that is because they are asking for disclosures. So they are putting pressure on organizations to inform on their ESG topics through a series of ESG disclosures, reporting standards, annual filings, et cetera, et cetera. And what this does is that it offers a level of transparency for all stakeholders to understand what your ESG position and strategies and plans are, and your processes for oversight are. That gives generously to all stakeholders to have access to that information. The emerging pressure from that group is the imminent reporting expectation on climate-related disclosures for the year ending in 2023. So organizations that do not have an understanding of climate-related concerns for their business and are required to have it included in their annual filings for the end of 2023, that's an imminent pressure. Like, that's next year, right? So that I would say is of significance. Rebecca?
Yeah, thanks for that. For sure, the foundation came from finance and investors, but as Shelley mentions, really pressures on organizations to respond to ESG are coming from all directions. And I think one key stakeholder group that's continuing to grow in terms of influence are employees. We're dealing with a changing labor market right now, and employee sentiments have shifted, especially in particular, the pandemic has prompted a lot of younger employees to reevaluate what they need or what they find as meaningful and fulfilling work. And so a lot of them are demanding that ESG be embedded into a company's vision, into a company's culture and the ways of working. So I think it's crucial that we see employees as being deeply involved in planning and delivering ESG, and in a way that's on an authentic fit between the purpose and the efforts, that their insights are invited and considered. And another aspect that we're measuring is that employees are being asked to be, or asking to be supported as well, to be reskilled, to be upskilled, to be able to develop these ESG capacities. So certainly from millennial and Gen Zs, as they move into more and more senior and active roles, we'll see that employee engagement and demands are going to drive this ESG process forward from an internal perspective.
Yeah, I think it's really a huge opportunity for organizations, right? That, there's these new areas that they're being asked to address, and there's an up and coming group of talent that is passionate about these topics. And I think figuring out how to intersect those things will be really powerful. So when we're thinking about 2023, it's almost the end of 2022, so we're looking ahead. What kind of trends do we see out there really impacting this space right now, Karen?
Thanks, Shelley. It's so much, I guess what we've been hearing recently, and it's not going away, so I guess the trend is going to continue. But when I first sort of started in the space 5 years ago, the ambition and the motivations that ESG was, bringing to life in people, like you could see the light bulbs go on, and you could see potential, not only in a leadership perspective, but bringing organizations forward to meet these pressures. Like there was just so much will. And sadly, in the past year, there has been a little bit of, uncertainty or, some pushing back against what the reality of ESG is. Is it fake? Is it, unrealistic? Is it, not relevant? And I don't think that's going to go away too soon. But I think what people will see is that there are solutions to, or there are explanations that can abide that notion or that pushback on ESG. So why is this pushback happening? It's happening because there is, as the industry or the area evolves and matures, there's more and more information that is made available on ESG, either the topic specifically, or by corporations that are fully involved or fully embraced and integrated on ESG. And the more information that is out there, the more reporting there is. And there's the utilization of reporting protocols like the global reporting, GRI or SASB, or what is just coming down the pipe with ISSB, all these acronyms. These are standards that evaluate companies' ESG, but they don't do it in a uniform way. And as that awareness of not having equitable information across industries or within sectors causes confusion, because one environmental metric may be different from the next company's environmental metric. Therefore, how can you compare? That comparability principle of ESG gets it questioned, and this is why we're seeing some of this backlash. But as this awareness gets heightened, there is more and more effort in unifying these reporting standards so that they do inform comparably and predictably, so that informed decisions can be made, and you can be more trusting and more validated with your reporting process. So, Rebecca, do you have another?
I do. I'd love to just put a little icing on what you just said, that in times of disruption and dynamic change, there is bound to be there's bound to be some confusion. And I think ESG are all evolving. They're evolving quickly, which provides both an opportunity to influence and participate, as well as the opportunity to push back. And there's vested players on both sides of that conversation. So that trend may not go away, but I think it's matched with the trend of seeing ESG actually more built into the strategic efforts of organizations. One trend, or I would consider it a driver that I think is inevitably pushing these conversations forward, is the actual impacts of climate change. I think what we've seen is a lot of the impacts of climate change on a planetary level have hit markets that aren't as influenced or have different government structures that allow for information to pass around. And now that we're talking about, for example, with Karen talking about a film shoot in BC, now the impacts are landing in our own backyard or in our neighbor's backyard, we're seeing a lot more action on these types of conversations. So I think that's a driver that's moving forward. And also I think social pressures as well. So we're seeing a lot of social disruption in the last 4 or 5 years, conversations that we wouldn't have had before in terms of equity and diversity and inclusion, truth and reconciliation. Those conversations are growing. Those trends are impacting that space, and they're impacting people's expectations of what the space looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. So the next question, maybe appropriately staged here, is about challenges. So, this really isn't easy work. And there's a report I think we're going to be sharing in the chat from Morningstar that identifies some of the top challenges that organizations are facing. And I'm sure no one on the call is going to be surprised. There are things like budget constraints, lack of resources, how to measure, reporting and disclosure, setting goals and targets, getting leadership buy-in, lack of internal expertise. So, a whole array of things there. And, it can be like, once organizations decide they need to work on this, it usually starts with identifying those topics, those opportunities and risk areas that they want to work on. And that piece can, I think, be a little bit more straightforward for them. But then it becomes the challenge of each of those topics or each of those issues and how they dig into that. So the two of you in the Design ESG program really focused on applying design thinking as a way to address these challenges. So I just wondered, Rebecca, if you could expand on that, and how are you finding organizations responding to these challenges, and what about this approach and philosophy, design in particular, really can serve that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and it really gets to the root of what we're trying to accomplish in this space. So thanks, Shelley, for asking it. So why did we bring design thinking to the table in terms of ESG? Well, maybe I'll just back up and say, what is design thinking, or also known as human-centered design? It's a problem-solving process. And I think it has some core areas of focus and methodology that really work in terms of ESG. One is that at its core, design thinking is relentlessly focused on the end user. So it uses a variety of sort of ethnographic research tools and methods to try and develop a deep understanding of what your audience or your end user is experiencing. And through a process of action learning, listening, observing, using these tools in toolkits. A design thinker practitioner can unearth insights and integrate them into more effective and impactful design solutions. Right? So why would that matter for designing ESG strategies? Well, what we do know, and what Karen can speak to often, is in organizations, people have their job descriptions, and then ESG is brought to the table, and it's like another thing to do. And so working closely to understand and learn from and collaborate with your colleagues, there's a much better chance that several things will occur. One is that you actually discover what are the right problems that you're trying to solve. Okay? What are the best opportunities that might happen if you're engaging the people who experience the challenge or are sitting in the situations? So for example, If someone's in procurement and they've been asked to decrease carbon in the supply chain, this is an area that we hear about quite a bit. As your ESG or sustainability person, your role from a design thinking perspective would be to enter their space with these useful tools, frameworks, or approaches that really open conversations, and they explore with the goal of understanding the pressures and the considerations in the day-to-day reality of this position, right? And these types of insights can arise during the process, can bring your sustainability knowledge to address that area. And this type of collaborative work with the end user often looks like co-designing solutions as well. And as an entrepreneur, which is what the ESG person often is, trying to make change within an organization, this is a sweet spot because we build accountability and ownership and participation into these types of processes. So these are inclusive, they're diverse, you hear a diverse number of perspectives, but they also have the credibility and authenticity that resonates with purpose-driven work. So we're really developing and collaborating and co-designing together. I think there's two other aspects of design thinking that are really useful for this type of work. One is that it is a prototype and iterative approach to problem solving. So moving into a prototype phase, recognizing that that's a step in a journey, reduces a lot of risk in terms of organizational change. And the iterative approach means that you're always learning, you're always applying new insights. And in times of dynamic disruption, that's a really useful approach to have, and can open up a lot of perhaps more innovative solution spaces in a quicker and less expensive timeline. Mm-hmm. And then I think for me, what I found the most illuminating from design thinking is that it's a very visual approach to thinking and to considering. And by using, so it uses different parts of your brain than reading and writing and building spreadsheets and a lot of the sort of strategy work that we do and day-to-day work that we do. And by mapping and visualizing and connecting the dots and grouping, these activities can not only be kind of fun and imaginative, but they actually help to unearth sort of tacit knowledge and help you make leaps in terms of adding value to the innovation process. So each of these things, the idea of end user centric, collaborative, and co-design work, the idea that it's iterative and over time, and that it's also kind of a new way of thinking. All of these are points of action that allow steps into the solution area. And honestly, I can't speak for everybody on the call, but personally, I found them really, really engaging. It really helped me break down some methods of work that weren't as productive. Mm-hmm. So that to me is where the designing part of designing ESG came in, and how we thought that it would be useful to professionals that are grappling in this solution space.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's fantastic. I can see how a lot of that applies obviously to ESG, but a lot of other areas within organizations as well. So reflecting on some of that, Karen, I'm wondering if you could share with us an example of an organization that you know that's been able to advance ESG, applying some of these principles and move their program ahead. I know people always like to hear about real life examples. So.
Yeah, well, I thought I would share two. Because what my experience in working with these clients was exceptional in that one happened just before COVID and one happened after COVID, and where you can see such a significant historical event. The ESG looked and felt a little bit different on both ends of the pandemic. So I believe there's some real estate individuals here on our call. My client is Hazelview Properties or Hazelview Communities, and I was working with them as they were trying to understand their sort of the S in ESG at the same time that they were implementing an ESG sort of initiative in response to their investor side of the business. They also wanted to have programs and ESG initiatives that reflected the communities that they reside in. So finding this balance of ESG having its impacts in both the investor space, but also the social economic space of the communities where their properties were being looked at to generate, if not an essential service in housing, but additional services that came out of nowhere because of COVID. The isolation that COVID drew on instantly, these properties were being looked at as being beacons of health, beacons of community that prevented isolation that was so strongly felt in the early days of COVID. So as our work initially was to generate an ESG program and have the S amplified for their communities as stakeholders, they now had to go into real-time action to support with social economic impacts that were immediately needed. They had tenants that were no longer working or had a break from work for whatever reason that COVID was putting this pressure on. They had lost their job had paused, they were laid off, etc. But the rental income became a concern because these individuals were now in a precarious position of not necessarily knowing where their rent money was coming from. The response by Hazelview was not to remove tenants, but to support them through this process. So they initiated a program pretty quickly that offered subsidies for the transition or as COVID moved through, so that tenants and individuals could remain in a place that offered them comfort and protection during a pandemic. So what this showed was the instant response to an economic driver can actually be achieved. And like it or not, by some individuals, the bureaucratic chain disappeared. And so now we know that you could implement something quickly if you needed to, because in a time of urgency, in a time of emergency, you can lose that bureaucracy pretty quickly. So the effect of having something put in place as a plan and then having to respond real time to a situation that was an additional layer to their plan, where their community impact was now no longer about being seen as a resource for housing or access to community programs. It was now seen as a health essential service, where their buildings became not only their homes, but also centers where they could receive information on the pandemic, receive information on where to get healthcare as needed, and receive education about programs in their community that were serving either food or job-related initiatives that could buffer this distance. So huge time for Hazelview to be so focused on ESG as an initiative, and then turn it on and elevate it and accelerate it 100 times to deliver against COVID. Mm-hmm. The other example I have is working with Cineplex post-pandemic, right? So Cineplex was certainly an organization which was hit hard, no question, through the pandemic. But its resilience in coming through, in recovering, as it grows through its recovery, is based significantly on its governance factors. The governance model, the governance and oversight of the board of directors, of the management, senior directors, and employees across the organization. That organization is so foundationally set in compliance levels, in business ethics, in policies and legal matters that would have put them at risk. A risk enterprise management tool and framework that is rock solid. All of these aspects of their business allowed them to be resilient for the social factors that were causing the most significant business performance, the employee base and their customers no longer coming to see movies. So their revenue dropped, and they were now in a situation where they were seen as a precarious employer because they had to lay off a number of employees across Canada. But again, their structure and their sound governance practices, when doors were opening, they are now in a position where they can evolve the essential programs of environmental, social, and governance that can meet today's recovery standards for their organization, but also help achieve or help unify the sector in meeting the expectations of the service it delivers. Now, what it learned from the pandemic and employee engagement, employee experience, employee health and well-being, not dissimilar to every organization that went through the pandemic, they are now in a place where those programs are significant, are stronger than ever, and are allowing potential employees a greater opportunity within Cineplex to thrive and meet the guest experience that we're all looking for in coming together and watching movies.
That's great. Thanks for those great examples, Karen. I think one of the things in a lot of my research is authenticity is really important in this work, and being able to, I think the first example is a great one of, a company maybe putting plans in place, but then, kind of proving it when it comes time to do that. So do you have any additional examples there, Rebecca, that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'd actually like to come at the question a little bit differently. So Karen, those are really great examples of, robust ESG strategies that stood disruption and tests of time. I want to just travel back a little bit to the design thinking tools and aspects and give an example of how design thinking can help evolve these from a real life perspective. And I wanted to share the story of one of the people that participated in the Designing ESG cohort this past summer. And they are a senior leader in ESG in a multinational corporation. And their area of activity is North America. And basically, as a new position, they had been asked to develop a plan. And one of the goals that this person had entered into the space with in the education space was, how do I build a team and how do I bring senior leadership along on this team? And so one of the tools that we had talked about as being useful for this ethnographic research and end user research is something called an empathy map. And I just want to use the empathy mapping as an example, because this is something that they shared back with us. They're like, oh, empathy map. What does this thing do? And it's a tool that asks a number of leading questions in order for you to be able to explore what individuals are thinking, what they're feeling, how they're acting, what kind of words they're using, what they're doing. And the goal of looking for all this type of information is to then really get a sense of, from this observable behavior, what are the pains that they are experiencing, and what are their challenges, and what kind of opportunities are they looking for, or how are they trying to create value. And so the story was that this person actually had because it's a large corporation, there were actually a number of different senior leaders that were going to be involved in vetting the process of building a team. And they told the story of how they had a whole wall that was covered with these empathy maps. They'd done like 6 or 8 maps for each of these key players. And what they discovered during that process was that there were a number of commonalities in terms of both opportunity areas as well as challenges that these senior leaders were having. And what the outcome of that process was is that this person felt far more empowered to be able to have those conversations, to be able to understand the type of language that they should adopt in order to express their ideas, and really to try and even prioritize entry into the space, the conversation space, in order to perhaps find some quicker wins as opposed to longer term challenges. So just an example of how design thinking can help with ESG in terms of whatever your particular intention is. And one of the tools that we developed for the course is called an intention planning tool. And it does exactly that. It takes all the pieces, the deep knowledge in ESG that Karen brings to the table, a number of these design thinking tools that we have, stakeholder conversations, and it brings all of that together into like, it's not a game because this is important work, but it's like a game insofar as what are the cards that I should be playing and how might they be useful for me in order to plan to meet my goals.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
So we're almost to the point where we're going to open it up to questions. So start thinking about your questions, everybody. And, I guess the last formal question here that I had is just some advice that you would give to folks on the call today about where to start. Like, what can they use tools that they can apply in their ESG journey that maybe they aren't aware of? And I know Tina's helping us out and going to be sharing a number of links as the team is responding here. Who wants to start with that one? I forget who was starting with that one.
I'm okay to hop in. I found when I was first starting to work in the sustainability sector that it was really helpful to find media that had comprehensive or authentic non-greenwashing information. And we're really lucky in Canada. There's a magazine called Corporate Knights with a K for Knights. They do really high quality reporting on what's happening in the sustainability sector in Canada. So I would absolutely suggest that you check out Corporate Knights or become a digital subscriber. They've got some really great tools, and they also publish a number of different lists of like the top sustainability employers, the top sustainability companies. So you can really see who's active in this space as well. And that's always great to look for reports and sort of take it to the next level. I also think I would suggest, like as I sort of mentioned earlier, I've had a little bit of a shift in my way of thinking about problem solving, and I've really got a lot of personal value as well as brought a lot of professional value by adopting a more empathetic and collaborative working process. And that's opened up so many opportunity areas for me and allowed me to enter this space with a lot more optimism, which is something that's hard to do in the climate space. Climate work is hard. And so finding your people, having a collaborative listening approach, I think is really important. So I would just encourage everybody on the call to think about that. How can I adopt and practice really inclusive methods when I'm doing my work? I'd say those were my two biggest suggestions in terms of getting into this space or staying in the space.
Thanks. And how about you, Karen? How do you want to wrap up with some final advice?
Yeah, I think if you're early days, like very early days, where there's not sort of the conversation happening at your organization, but you just want to understand what does the scope of ESG look like, I would encourage you to look at some very large ESG reports by corporations that have significant maturity in the space, and those organizations that have a depth and breadth to them where their report is going to be comprehensive. So a financial institution, a bank specifically, RBC or TD, both have exceptional quality ESG reports from a breadth and depth and comprehensive perspective. If you consider their understanding of all E, S, and G elements that are of relevance for not only them as an organization, but all of their stakeholders, you can see where the strategies, where the risks, where the influences come into play. And they articulate the best opportunities and the best progress and growth that they have in those specific ES and G topics. They're also comprehensive because they support with the metric, the not so pretty side of ESG, all the metrics and KPIs, where the reporting standard like SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, or Global Reporting Initiative, all the numbers and KPIs, metrics, et cetera, they also include that in their ESG reports. So they're long, but it does help you understand the scope and scale of where ESG can go. Now, financial institutions are obligated to have this type of comprehensive approach on their disclosures. That does not mean that you, if you're a smaller size or a one-person show, you do not have to have this depth and breadth. But as Rebecca says, there's an authentic approach to how you are thinking about the relevant ESG topics for your organization. It will help give you that understanding. You will see, if you can compare different sectors or different industries, you will see differences in ESG reports. So another one that I would suggest, just from a comparison exercise, is Walmart's ESG report, because it is a more consumer or customer focused initiatives that they are bringing to life, but they are also very relevant in the supply chain space. So understanding your footprint when it comes to ESG, it's not just about your organization specifically, it is about your vendors, your partners, and your stakeholders in your supply chain. As it comes to their process and service delivery, where are their impacts specifically on human rights if you have a global reach? So looking at those two back to back will help see where you can make your approaches look different with ESG, which is absolutely okay. One little secret about ESG, and this is why the design principles are so fundamental, is that it shouldn't necessarily look like everyone else's. You should have a customized approach because your business is unique. You will have indicators or topics that are of significant relevance for your organization and yours only. So do not shy away from something that is standing out from the rest of your sector, as it shows that you have, again, a lens that is relevant to your business, your style of leadership, and your method of delivery that differentiates you. Mm-hmm. So a little desktop research on comparing ESG reports, I would certainly encourage that.
I guess I have two ideas to add to this question as well. One, I would say, look at the values and the culture of the organization and start there and make sure that your values and your expectations of people, leadership alignment, and that are are designed to support, because sometimes there's work there to do before you can even have impact on some of these things. And then I also want to key in on something Grant shared in the chat about B Corp being a useful tool for smaller organizations. Ramp, my company, is a B Corp, and so I would totally agree with that. And I tell people all the time, even if you have no intention of becoming a B Corp, sign up for the assessment. Begin to answer if you go through the questions in the tool and you begin to think of where do you sit on these answers, even if you have no intention of becoming certified, the assessment tool does provide a really great framework to begin to figure out where you're at with this. So so I've seen we have at least one question coming up in the chat, but just before we turn it on to questions, I realize people may be starting to drop off. It was booked for 90 minutes, but I know, sometimes people have constraints in that. So just before we delve into the Q&A for anybody who wants to stay and pick our brains, maybe Rebecca, you can share a little bit about where people can find you and how the Designing ESG program may be able to support them.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, in brief, if you're interested in finding out more about this particularly unique combination of ESG fundamentals, so learning about these foundational aspects of how to enter ESG in terms of a strategic mindset for your organization, that comes from Karen, and combined with some design principles, please feel free to get in touch with us. So we're hello@designingesg.com, or you can check out our website, designingesg.com. We've also recently, our vision isn't just to, ideally everybody that I know that works in ESG wants ESG to stop being ESG and to just be the world. And so we're all working to put ourselves out of business, really, in a perfect world. And so the vision for us isn't so much about just selling the product of the training. It's to build a community of thriving ESG professionals and people that are interested in this space. So we just recently had an in-person meetup. It was our first one to spark these conversations, and we're going to do a series of those as well. So if you'd like to become part of our community, please feel free to contact us or hop on our newsletter link there and sign up. And we'll send out opportunities that don't necessarily include studying with us, but actually talk about the ways in which we're building community together to solve these problems and create really great solutions. So that would be from the Designing ESG perspective. Both, we're all on LinkedIn, so please feel free to reach out there. And Shelley, I'd also like to mention your Enlightened Brands program, and maybe you could share a little bit about that. You've been delightful to host us today, but there's such synergy between the work that you're doing at the brand level and what we're trying to do at the design ESG level. So I think they're very complementary.
Sure. Yeah, the work we're doing with Enlightened Brands is around the holistic adoption of purpose throughout organizations. And of course, ESG is the foundation of that. And so I've developed a model and an assessment tool to help organizations understand, from a readiness perspective, where they are on that purpose journey. And, as I mentioned, values and culture at the outset are really important. Understanding, somebody mentioned it in the chat, maybe I think it was Grant as well, that, when you're doing this kind of work, the kinds of examples, great examples that Karen shared, like how is that experience translating to consumers? How is that experience translating to employees? So how do you take the great work that you're doing and put that out in the world in a way that's sort of integrated with your brand communications and your organizational strategies? So that's some of the work that we're doing. And I'm running monthly Enlightened Brands webinars or information sessions. If anyone wants to sign up, I think Tina's going to put the link to that in the chat. So with that, we'll move on to, we'll kick it off with Grant's question that he posted in the chat. So how do you find people open to collaboration? What is a good initial approach? And just while you two are collecting your thoughts around that question, I will say that you don't have to only put the questions in the chat. I would invite people to, we're a little bit of a smaller group. A few people have dropped off, like pop your cameras on and come off mute if you're comfortable, and feel free to use the raise hand feature, and we can have, a bit of a face-to-face discussion about some of these questions with you. So we'll kick it off with Grant's question. Once again, that was, how do you find people open to collaboration? What is a good initial approach?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
So here's how I propose having those conversations, because this is what we're doing now when we talk about working with clients, or even when we're speaking with the people in the course, is that to collaborate, I think you have to lead with collaboration. You have to lead with an authentic willingness to be open and to be collaborative right from the start. So I would say you can quickly determine by the response to a collaborative type of opening of space whether other people are also sharing that type of mindset. It's a little bit of a weak answer, because I think that's very piece by piece, conversation by conversation. But personally, I'm quite intentional about the direction that I'd like to go in, and so I look for people that already appear to offer the value that I'm trying to look to build, or are already active in that space. I approach them in with transparency around a collaborative process. If there's a reticence to work collaboratively, or you can see that that's something that's not in their culture, what I'm often doing now with my clients is actually building it in as a deliverable. It's like having a workshop up front to talk about what collaboration and design thinking looks like and how that might show up over the course of a project. And then actually like building in some reflective exercises, building in some opportunities to practice it, to actually help shift culture as we move through this space. And I'd also like to say that both with designing ESG and with the work that I'm doing at Blackcurrant that uses a sort of a more collaborative decision-making basis, we're also using design thinking to actually develop these types of programs. So designing ESG was offered this past summer as a prototype. And our next class, the next cohort starts on January 11th. And it is absolutely considered a work in progress. We learned so much from building the prototype and testing it in the market, and we had great feedback about it. We have to be open to that and constantly opening that space and observing behavior and using some of the same tools that we're encouraging people to use to develop ESG in their organization, we're using to develop designing ESG, and I'm using with my clients as well. Mm-hmm. So a few different areas to enter that conversation. Grant, is that helpful? Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. That's a great question.
Any other questions? Anybody want to come off mute and ask a question? Any questions in the chat? I don't see any new questions in the chat.
How about from our initial list, Shelley? Do you have anything there that was particular to this? Hasn't been touched on?
Yeah, there was a couple good ones there. Let's see. One of them that I think we really liked was how viable and valuable is an ESG strategy for our firm?
So I can share.
I think it was in the context of maybe like a professional services type of firm.
So I can share that at its heart, ESG is to actually interpret your enterprise value. For investor or a lender perspective, it is innate to support or inform on your enterprise value. So from a valuable perspective, you can absolutely use ESG as a construct or a framework to be able to inform on where your value is organizationally from an ESG perspective, but also from a strategy and risk perspective, you can certainly identify that. The other side of that was it valid? Is that what the question,
viable, like how viable is it? And I don't know, on that point, I almost go back to the point I made earlier on the B Corp thing. Like, you know, I think it's viable. I have an extremely small organization and we did become a certified B Corp, and, you know, there are sort of levels of sophistication you can use with some of the stuff, but putting a lens across everything, the B Corp framework can be a really good place to get started because it kind of walks you through.
But every sorry, Rebecca, every ES&G topic, the majority of environmental and social topics, you can actually convert using a P&L, a profit and loss, expense and revenue metric to either set as your baseline and therefore show your progress against and aspirational growth in those areas. So there's a fair amount of formulas from a budgeting perspective that you can put in when you think of your utilities use, when you think of your human capital, when you think of your risk mitigation and your brand opportunities, and then new business channel or new market, there is absolutely revenues you can put into that. Sorry, Rebecca.
No, that's fine. I think, and there's a question in the chat about what are some resources that can be used for this cost benefit analysis that you were speaking of. So that might be a useful thing to follow up or
I will plug our best known Canadian, Bob Willard, Sustainability Advantage, open source, and amazing intelligence. I would always recommend you cite Bob and Sustainability Advantage when you use his work, but it is like he hands it over to you on an Excel sheet that is brilliant.
Yeah, no,
Sustainability Advantage.
and he's an OG of sustainability. I mean, 15 or 18 years ago, when I was doing business in the environment at Schulich, he came as one of our guest speakers then. So he's been in this space for a long time, continues to evolve. That's a really great example. And I was going to say, taking it off the books. So absolutely what you've said in terms of if you're looking for financial insight, if you're fundraising, if you're looking for investment, if you're looking for valuation, then ESG is essential. But I would also say, touching on some of those softer, less tangible, but just as impactful implications of not having an ESG perspective. So what kind of talent are you looking to hire? Who do you want on your team? How long do you want them to stay with you? You need to develop a culture of authenticity. You need to have a futures forward perspective, which what ESG does. It doesn't just measure what's happening now, it gives you resilience in the future. And I think that matters when it comes to who's going to join your team, as well as who's going to fund your business, who's going to buy your products, to Shelley's point about Enlightened Brands and the power of consumers to drive decisions. So I think those are all really useful.
One of the other questions we highlighted from the original submissions was from Monica, and I believe Monica's still on the line. So the question was how to best market ESG internally, which kind of dovetails from the point you just made, Rebecca, and specifically with respect to employee engagement, buy-in, and commitment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there's certain ways of moving into this space, but it has to come from the leadership on down. If leadership isn't on board, ESG is not going to happen authentically, and that's been proven time and again. So we hear about great leaders that open these spaces. And one of the participants in our course last summer, actually, there was pressure from the diversity group to the CEO saying, we want ESG happening in this organization. And so it was announced in a town hall and then given to her. So ESG has to start at the top, but it needs to be incorporated throughout the organization. And so I think with leadership on board, or at least leadership saying they're on board, then that door opens. We did, for the course, we did a number of different leadership personas that were authentic, resistant, and sort of engaged but inauthentic. And I think we all have, certainly those were based on Karen's experience in the organization. So
I'm finding as well, like one of the companies we're working with right now decidedly chose to take a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach to planning the strategy. And so we're beginning a process with that organization, but the way the process has been constructed is there will be an invitation to employees to get involved in the strategic development of this direction, and to kind of get in on the ground and participate and contribute and design, like co-create the solution. And as part of that co-creation of the solution, those employees then become ambassadors for the work going forward, and become the voice in the company to bring others along. So that's one way, one approach we're taking, and it does go back to the earlier point I made as well around values and culture, and ensuring that the values and culture of the organization are supportive of this, because I think the way the question was worded is how to best market ESG, but ultimately, I don't know if it's a marketing activity as much as it's wanting to infiltrate the mindset of this throughout everybody's way of being, way of working, and way of doing things. And so that, goes to work process and behaviors and how meetings are conducted, and just, kind of every aspect of how you do business. So.
yeah.
Do you want to add anything, Karen, to that one?
Other than I've just had that real life experience. So where there's a dynamic happening. So you have leadership, and then you have the generation that is moving into junior or mid-level management level roles that have been brought up on this understanding of sustainable development, understanding of the legacy that is being left behind for them, and they clearly understand their voice in activism and being advocates for what they care about. So if you see the organization where there is this understanding of ESG or sustainable development at the more junior level, and there's not the understanding at a senior level, it causes this imbalance. And I have actually witnessed where the knowledge base and the strategic abilities on ESG topics are crystal clear for a younger professional, and someone that has 10 or 15 years in their career doesn't have the sightlines of ESG because they haven't had to use it so far. And there can be a bit of an opposition, and this may be why collaborative efforts fail, is that the knowledge of ESG at that at that director level is not fulsome enough for them to, one, be seen as a good leader for their junior executives, and also be able to talk about ESG upwards to their management level executives. So it may be part of the reason why collaborations fail or just stall. And the frustration is the employee turnover because it's not seen to actually happen or be seen as actionable. And the other response by their leaders might just be a placation where, yeah, we'll say we're doing it, but never really follow through on a more fulsome level that would generate success in the ESG space for their organization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Grant just popped in another question there. Maybe, Grant, you can expand a bit. The question is, can we talk a bit about diversity? So maybe you can provide some color around that conversation.
Well, it's the S part of ESG. I think that there have been studies that diverse organizations are more successful in the long run. So I guess it really is up to the company to implement policies, HR policies, training policies, commit to having women and minorities on the boards. Those types of discussions I think need to happen, not just on the environmental side and not just on the governance side. Well, governance is a big piece, but I guess diversity is something we haven't really addressed specifically. It's included, but.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hop in on there. Thank you for bringing up diversity. I think it's an essential piece of all of the world, and that's a systemic issue in terms of a lack of representation at any sort of decision-making level. So it's something that I think there's a lot of arguments that have been made already for diversity in terms of, we know the economic argument. We know that if there's a more diverse group of people making decisions and that they've had the opportunity to share their voice, that the decisions are generally more robust. There's like numeric stuff on that's been around for 10 years. There's all sorts of things. So what's holding us back? Because change is very slow, and that's about systemic change. And really, even to the point of what Shelley was, both Shelley and Karen talked about, like we've got a whole generation of people that aren't necessarily in leadership roles that have a clear line on this stuff. They have a much more open mind just based on the way that they've experienced life. I think that it's a huge challenge, and it needs to be embraced as part of ESG, as an imperative for the organization. And we're hearing that from the field as well. So there's a great organization called Feminuity that works on gender diversity and equity within organizations. And a colleague of ours, actually one of our guest speakers from the Designing ESG program, Steph Rebello, is active there. She came from a DEI perspective in a larger organization where she was given the file, but she didn't have that leadership. It was just overburdened with the amount of change that was required from one person. So we've seen a lot of that. I think that's shifting a little bit, and there are organizations that are helping to move those conversations forward. And then there's a whole bulge of workers that are actually pushing these conversations forward as well. But it's a great example of an area that still we need a lot of work. Like, don't get us wrong, because we're having a webinar on ESG doesn't mean it's like going gangbusters. I personally feel the pressure both on the climate piece and the social piece every working day of my career. So I know that there's a lot of work to be done, but it's going to have to happen. And in the same way that you enter a space, I think with a collaborative mindset, what you bring to the table and what you're willing to contribute, but also where you're willing to step away. So organizations that are not willing to diversify, that are not willing to open space, or not even acknowledge that that space needs to be open, they will not get the best players. They will not rise to the top. And I think that's really useful. And anima leadership, that's great. So I'm not familiar with that. I'll definitely look at that. There are people out there working on the opportunity area for sure. And I sort of sucked the air. Sorry, I hopped in there.
That was a great answer, Rebecca. Do you have anything to add to that, Karen?
I guess just from my lens, there's often the exclusion of ESG because we have a D&I program, so we don't do ESG. And I think this is one of the misunderstandings, is that they will complement, but they're integrated. So, which may be the same thing, but I feel like the application of DE&I for ESG is an imperative, and it can be often done in silos, and that would not be an effective approach for both. As you understand the social aspects of the environmental impact, it doesn't work that way. And as the environmental impacts are causing greater inequities, it doesn't work the other way as well.
Mm-hmm. So true. Thank you. Great answers. Any last questions from anybody? I've been through the questions that were posed on the registration list, and I don't think any of the folks that are still here on the call had any additional ones.
I had one question actually for Karen. So Grant posted, regulation is tightening, especially in the EU. And I know that south of the border, there's also new rules for reporting. Could you maybe just talk about that, Karen, in terms of when we look at regulation in the Canadian marketplace, where are we at? What do you think is next in terms of what organizations need to do?
It's a great question.
Yeah, so I guess under the influence, so the European Union is absolutely advanced by many, many years. And so much so that they actually now have the EU taxonomy, which gives criteria for what is deemed sustainable. So greenwashing can be mitigated, as that is seen as a sincere concern with progress in this space. The US is following suit, as the SEC has just passed their climate disclosures. And so mandating that in the US space is now there. Where we're at in Canada is the CSA, the Canadian Securities Administrators, have put out into the comment space. That comment time has now closed as of earlier this year, I believe, early spring in 2020, where comments on disclosing your climate-related financial impacts are to be mandated. So the early days of that being adopted is showing up in climate disclosures are now required in your annual filings, but you do not have to include an ESG report, but you do have to show what is materially financial when it comes to climate-related exposure in your annual filings for the year 2023. That means by March of 2024, your report has to include this. Those are for corporations that are listed on the TSX. For those that are not listed on the TSX, you have another 3 years grace period before that becomes mandated. That's where we sit right now. There could be changes as there is no formal legislation and regulation that is in place, but based on the legal conversation that is happening and also the federal government conversation that is happening, it is looking likely for that timeline.
And is that just for for-profit corporations? How does that apply to nonprofits or other players in the space? We know there's tons of small, medium enterprises in Canada.
Correct. So no, it is only for corporations. It is not for nonprofits or NGOs.
Or SMEs.
SMEs, you mean small, medium enterprises?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're listed on the TSX, whether your size, yeah, you have to disclose.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd be curious what that looks like.
Well, you can look up the TCFD, the financial disclosures on climate risk. It does give guidance on what you need to articulate. There is a little bit of a loophole where you can state that you can't disclose on your climate related impacts, but you have to give the reason why. So at least there is a paper trail of your progress.
Cool, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for both of you. I don't think there's any more questions coming in. So, and we're almost 2 minutes from time. So I guess we'll wrap up, but I just would love to extend a huge thank you, Karen and Rebecca, for your work assisting in putting this together and all the brilliance that you bring to this session. Also a shout out to Tina for joining us and helping as our chat poster and making sure the logistics of everything went smoothly today. For those of you that are still here and hung in with us right to the very end, thank you so much for joining the session today and for your engagement and interest in the questions and such. And thanks also for the great comments that came in through the chat that really make the conversation more dynamic. So we appreciate that. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be also sharing the recording if you have colleagues that you would like to share this with.
Thanks for hosting us, Shelley.